Ever think about how quickly things can change? Like, in the blink of an eye, the whole global economy does a 180.
Yeah, for sure.
And then, bam, it hits you right where you live. I mean, we're talking about something most people use every single day. Their smartphones.
True.
So that's what we're diving into today, and it's pretty fascinating, I gotta say.
Definitely.
So we've got some really interesting sources here that point to some pretty big potential changes coming down the pipeline.
Mm-hmm.
Specifically, we're looking at the possibility of some serious new tariffs.
Right.
And we're talking like reciprocal tariffs, which, I mean, even the name sounds kind of intense, right?
It does.
The U.S. is considering slapping these on, and it could shake things up big time for the big guys in the smartphone world, you know, Apple and Samsung.
Absolutely.
So our big question for this deep dive is, what happens if these tariffs, we're talking potentially 40 to 50%, what if they actually become a reality? Mm-hmm. How will that impact the whole smartphone market? And what kind of moves might Apple and Samsung have to make to navigate this?
Yeah.
We're going to try to cut through all the economic mumbo jumbo and figure out what this means for us, like the immediate consequences and the long-term stuff based on what we know right now. Sound good?
Let's do it.
Okay, so first things first. Let's unpack these proposed tariffs a little bit.
Sure.
This whole reciprocal thing. What's the deal with that?
Well, I think the idea is to create a kind of level playing field in terms of trade, right? So the U.S. wants to target countries that are, super involved in the supply chain for Apple and Samsung phones.
Gotcha. Okay, so let's get down to brass tacks.
Yeah.
Apple, most of their manufacturing, like 90% of their iPhones, are made in China.
Right.
Now, we're talking about adding these new reciprocal tariffs on top of what's already there, which is 20%, right?
Right.
So the new ones would be 34%, so we're looking at a total of 54%. That's huge.
It is a big increase.
So for Samsung, it's a different story. More than half their production happens in Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
And under these proposed tariffs, Vietnam is looking at 43%. Then you've got India, where Samsung makes about 30% of their phones, and they've got a 26% tariff.
Yeah.
And then the rest of their production is scattered around. Brazil at 10%, Indonesia at 32%, and even South Korea, specifically in Gumi, at 25%.
Right.
It's like a crazy quilt of different rates based on all these trade agreements and political stuff.
Yeah, exactly. The global trade landscape is very complex.
So right off the bat, we can see Apple's in a tighter spot, right?
Yes.
Because they're so focused on China with that potentially massive tariff, whereas Samsung is more spread out with some lower rates mixed in.
Exactly.
And that brings us to the big question, pricing.
Right.
Starting with Apple, given that they're so heavily reliant on China, analysts are saying that Apple's probably going to have to pass a big chunk of these new costs directly onto, well, us.
That seems like the most likely scenario.
The consumers.
Yeah.
And, I mean, we're not talking about a few bucks here and there.
No, not at all.
Some folks are saying the iPhone 16 series could see an overall price jump of like 30 to 40%.
Wow.
Yeah. Let that sink in for a minute. And it gets even crazier when you look at specific models. Like, the top-of-the-line iPhone 16 Pro Max with the terabyte of storage, which is already like $1,599 in the U.S., could go up to almost $2,300.
Wow.
That's a 43% increase on an already expensive phone.
That's a lot.
Even the base model iPhone 16, the one that starts at $799 right now, could shoot up to like $11,142. So what do you think? Would you still upgrade your phone as often if you were looking at a $2,300 price tag?
I don't know about that. It might make me think twice, for sure.
Right. Maybe you'd consider a different brand or just hang on to your current phone longer.
Yeah, possibly.
This could change the whole game for high-end phones. Now, of course, Apple might try to eat some of that cost, especially in key markets, to stay competitive, but that would obviously hit their profits.
Right.
Okay, so let's talk about Samsung. With their production spread out like it is, they might be better positioned to weather this tariff storm. Their average tariff exposure across all their manufacturing is likely to be lower than Apple's, so they have more wiggle room to maybe absorb some of the cost or at least avoid those crazy price hikes.
Yeah, that's what it looks like.
So their strategy becomes super important here. They have options that Apple just doesn't, at least in the short term.
Yeah.
There's this professor, Kyung-hee Kwon, who thinks Samsung could shift more of their U.S. production to countries with lower tariffs, like their facilities in Brazil and South Korea.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not by accident. Over the past 10 years or so, Samsung has been investing in manufacturing in Southeast Asia, to reduce risk and take advantage of lower labor costs and different trade deals.
That's smart.
It was a smart move, and now it's paying off. Because, I mean, if you've got a big chunk of your production in Vietnam facing a 43% tariff, moving some of that to Brazil at 10% or even South Korea at 25%, well, that takes off a lot of pressure. And get this, Samsung already shipped their Galaxy S25 series to the US before any of this tariff talk even started.
Oh, wow.
So those phones are in the clear. But their new foldable phones, the Galaxy Z Fold and Z Flip, those will probably be hit by the new tariffs, so they'll need a plan for that.
Yeah.
So even though Samsung looks better off in the short run, I'm wondering, what are some potential downsides or challenges for them? I mean, could they see a surge in demand in the U.S. if Apple's prices skyrocket?
It's possible.
And that could strain their production capacity in those lower tariff countries.
Right.
And trying to ramp up production quickly can be expensive and tricky.
Absolutely.
Plus, we don't know what's going to happen with tariffs on other components or materials.
That's true.
That could still impact their overall costs. And in the U.S. market, where Samsung has about 20% market share, the general feeling is that if they can just hold on to that under these new tariffs, that would be considered a win.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
Now, if Apple's prices do go way up, even if Samsung has to raise their prices a little, they might actually end up in a stronger position, relatively speaking.
Makes sense.
Okay, but this isn't just about numbers, right?
No, definitely.
There's a lot of politics and strategy mixed in here. The information we have suggests that Apple might actually be able to get some tariff exemptions like they did during Mr. Trump's first term.
Yeah, that's possible.
So there's a lot of uncertainty.
Right.
And Lee Kuhey from Nice Investor Service pointed out that there's a history of the U.S. looking out for its own companies. And even though Apple makes most of their phones in China, they're still a big American brand, and they invest a lot in the U.S.
Right.
In fact, Apple has been working hard to stay on good terms with the Trump administration, even announcing plans to invest a whopping $500 billion in the U.S. over the next 4 years.
Really?
Including a major AI server facility in Texas, which will create something like 20,000 new jobs. That's a big commitment.
It is.
So maybe these tariffs aren't a done deal. Mr. Trump even said, and I quote, "Tariffs give us great power to negotiate." So maybe they're using them as leverage to get something else.
Right.
Oh, and there's also this interesting thing that happened. Mr. Trump posted on social media about having a productive call with Vietnam's General Secretary to Lam.
Really?
And he even mentioned the possibility of Vietnam dropping their tariffs to zero in a deal with the U.S.
Wow.
Now, if that were to happen, that would be a huge win for Samsung, wouldn't it?
Oh, yeah, considering how much they produce in Vietnam.
Exactly. It just shows how these global trade negotiations can shift so fast depending on what's happening politically.
Definitely. And as we're talking about all of this, the political stuff, it's important to remember that we're just presenting the information as it is, not taking sides or anything.
Right.
Just laying it all out there.
Absolutely. So zooming out a bit, beyond the immediate price changes and market share stuff, what are some of the bigger long-term consequences these tariffs could have?
That's a good question.
Yeah, like how could this reshape things down the road?
Well, Lee Kuhey brought up a really interesting point. He said Korean companies like Samsung might face more and more pressure to move their production to the U.S. if the U.S. keeps favoring domestic companies with these tariffs and exemptions. So you could see a whole reshuffling of global supply chains, and not just for smartphones. This could affect other industries too.
That's a big deal.
Yeah.
And there's this other article out there with a pretty attention-grabbing title, Trump Tariffs Sow Fears of Trade Wars, Recession, and a $3,000 iPhone.
Oh.
We don't have the full article, but it definitely hints at some broader economic worries tied to these trade policies.
Definitely.
It suggests that the impact could go way beyond just how much your next phone costs.
Yeah, for sure.
It could trigger trade wars and even a recession.
Right.
So to wrap things up, for you, our listener, here are the key takeaways. These proposed tariffs are a real problem for Apple because they're so dependent on manufacturing in China, and that means iPhones could get a lot more expensive. Samsung, on the other hand, with their more diverse production setup, might have a bit of an edge in the short term, but they still have to make some strategic choices, and they could face some long-term challenges as well.
Right.
So the price of that smartphone you're using right now, it's actually connected to all this global economic and political stuff. It's pretty wild when you think about it.
It is.
So here's something to ponder. Given all this potential upheaval, how do you think the smartphone world is going to change in the coming years? I mean, will people be willing to pay a lot more for premium phones? Or will this push people towards more affordable options?
Good question.
Could we see a big shift in where phones are made?
Possibly.
And what does all of this tell us about how interconnected everything is, from global supply chains to the gadgets we use every day?
Yeah, it's definitely a lot to think about.
It is. It's a lot to think about.
Mhm.